My name is Aurelia Beaumont, and for the first 26 years of my life, I believed that my path was a line drawn in permanent ink. It was a path sketched out by my parents, Marcus and Isabella, in the quiet, sun-drenched rooms of our ancestral home in Charleston, South Carolina. Our house, with its sprawling verandas and ancient, moss-draped oaks, was a landmark in the city's historic district, a testament to the Beaumont name and the legacy I was expected to uphold. I was their only child, the vessel for all their deferred dreams and meticulous ambitions. My childhood was a curated collection of beautiful, quiet moments. I learned piano not because I loved music, but because a Beaumont daughter played. I studied literature not for the stories, but because it was the cornerstone of a classical education. My parents' love was a thing of structure and expectation, a calm, steady pressure to be polished, to be perfect. It was a love I understood, even if it often left a hollow ache in my chest, a yearning for something less conditional, more vibrant. I thought I had found that vibrancy in Sebastian. We met in college, and he was everything my life was not: spontaneous, a little messy, full of an easy laughter that seemed to bubble up from a place of genuine joy. He was a scholarship kid from a world away from mine, studying architecture with a passion that both fascinated and slightly alarmed my parents. To them, he was a project, a piece of unrefined clay they believed I could mold into something suitable. For 3 years, I tried. I smoothed his rough edges, taught him which fork to use, and gently corrected his grammar, all while his bright, untamed spirit was the very thing I had fallen in love with. Our engagement felt less like a promise and more like a treaty. My parents had finally, reluctantly, consented, their approval a fragile truce granted on the condition that our life together would adhere to their standards. The wedding was to be the ultimate embodiment of this agreement, a grand affair at our Charleston home, a union not just of two people, but of Sebastian's potential and my family's prestige. I threw myself into the planning with a desperate, hopeful energy. I chose cream-colored magnolias and pale blush roses, the scent of which I hoped would overpower the faint, cloying smell of obligation that clung to every decision. I tasted cakes, selected invitations with embossed lettering, and spent hours with my mother discussing guest lists that read like a directory of the city's oldest families. Through it all, I held on to a fragile vision of the future. I imagined a life where, once the wedding was over, Sebastian and I could finally breathe. A life where my parents would see him not as an acquisition, but as the man who made their daughter happy. I pictured our own home, filled not with the quiet hum of expectation, but with the loud, beautiful chaos of a life truly lived. If you had asked me just a year ago what my wedding day would look like, I would have told you about the heavy, sweet air of a Carolina summer, the gentle rustle of palmetto leaves, and the sound of a string quartet playing softly on the lawn. I used to close my eyes and see it all. My father, Marcus, walking me down a petal-strewn aisle, his face a mask of stoic pride. My mother, Isabella, watching from the front row, her approval the silent blessing I had sought my entire life, and Sebastian, waiting for me under the ancient oak tree, his nervous smile a promise of the freedom to come. I believed in the story I was creating, the fairy tale I was meticulously crafting from the materials of my gilded cage. But stories, I have learned, have a life of their own. They twist and turn in ways you can never anticipate. And on the morning of my wedding, the story I thought I was writing was abruptly, cruelly set on fire. The day began not with a symphony of birdsong and joyful anticipation, but with an unnerving silence. I woke before dawn, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, a familiar rhythm of hope and anxiety. Tiptoeing from my room, I expected to find the house already humming with life, caterers in the kitchen, florists arranging blooms on the mantelpiece, my mother directing it all with her usual imperious calm. Instead, the house was still. The air was thick and motionless, heavy with the scent of day-old jasmine and something else, something I couldn't place. I padded down the grand, curving staircase, my bare feet silent on the cool, polished wood. The dining room was dark, the long mahogany table empty. The kitchen, which should have been the bustling heart of the morning, was deserted. A single cup of coffee, half drunk and cold, sat on the marble countertop. It was my father's. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. My parents were creatures of habit and precision. For them to be absent on this day of all days was more than strange, it was inconceivable. I checked my phone, my thumb swiping over the smooth glass in search of a text, a missed call, any explanation for the void they had left behind. There was nothing. I wandered through the downstairs rooms, my own home suddenly feeling like a stranger's. The ghosts of my childhood seemed to watch from every corner, a younger me practicing scales on the piano, a teenage me reading novels in the window seat, a me of yesterday, full of a brittle, manufactured hope. The silence felt like a judgment. Just as a knot of real fear began to tighten in my stomach, I heard a sound from the foyer. I turned to see my mother standing in the arched doorway, silhouetted against the pale morning light. She was dressed not for a wedding, but for a journey, wearing a crisp linen pantsuit and practical flats. In her hand, she held the handle of a sleek, silver suitcase. My father appeared behind her, his favorite cashmere travel sweater draped over his shoulders, his expression unreadable behind a pair of dark sunglasses. A wave of disbelief washed over me, so potent it left me dizzy. "Where are you going?" The words came out as a whisper, thin and fragile in the cavernous hall. My mother didn't answer immediately. Her movements were deliberate, devoid of their usual warmth. She stepped forward and handed me a large, rectangular box, exquisitely wrapped in cream-colored silk paper and tied with a thick, forest green ribbon. It was beautiful, elegant, and impossibly cold. "A wedding gift," she said, her voice as smooth and hard as river stones. "For your future." She avoided my eyes, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. Before I could form a question, before I could process the chilling finality in her tone, she turned away. "Our flight to Florence leaves in 2 hours. We mustn't be late." My father paused in front of me. For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, pity, perhaps, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He placed his hands on my shoulders in a gesture that was more of a restraint than an embrace. "Be a good girl, Aurelia," he murmured, the old, familiar refrain. Then he followed my mother out the door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, the sound echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. I stood frozen, clutching the silk-wrapped box to my chest, the sharp corners digging into my arms. My mind refused to comprehend what had just happened. They had left. On my wedding day, they had simply walked away, leaving me with nothing but a beautifully wrapped box and the deafening silence of their departure. I wanted to scream, to shatter something, to run out into the manicured street and demand an answer. But my feet were rooted to the floor. Slowly, as if in a trance, I carried the box up the stairs to my room. The house felt like it was shrinking around me, the walls closing in. The next few hours are a blur in my memory. My bridesmaids arrived, their laughter and cheerful chatter a jarring counterpoint to the turmoil raging inside me. They flitted around me, a whirlwind of silk robes and champagne flutes, trying to coax me into a celebratory mood. I smiled, I nodded, I let them fuss over my hair and makeup, but my mind was miles away, trapped in that moment in the foyer. Through it all, the box sat on my antique vanity, a silent, ominous presence. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I was terrified of what I might find inside, of the message it was meant to send. Finally, when my friends were momentarily distracted by the arrival of the photographer, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. My hands trembled as I sat before the vanity, my own reflection a pale, wide-eyed stranger. I carefully untied the thick ribbon, my fingers fumbling with the knot. I lifted the lid, and I forgot how to breathe. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, was my wedding dress. The one my mother and I had picked out together in a chic boutique downtown. The one she'd said made me look like royalty. An ethereal creation of French lace and hand-sewn seed pearls. But it was ruined. Great, angry patches of the delicate fabric were blackened and charred. The hem was a jagged line of scorched, melted lace. The bodice, once pristine, was stained with soot. A sickening, acrid smell of smoke and finality rose from the box, filling the room. On top of the desecrated dress lay a single sheet of my mother's heavy, cream-colored stationery. I unfolded it with numb, clumsy fingers. In her perfect, elegant script, 7 words were written. "Let's see how you get married now." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from my lungs. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a mistake. It was a declaration of war. A calculated act of cruelty so profound I couldn't absorb it. This was their answer to my choice, to my love for Sebastian, to my quiet, desperate bid for a life of my own. They hadn't just left, they had taken a torch to my dream. As if on cue, my phone rang, its cheerful, chiming tone a brutal intrusion. I saw Sebastian's name flash on the screen. For a single, insane moment, a wave of hope surged through me. He would fix this. He would tell me it didn't matter. We would run away, just the 2 of us. I answered, my voice a strangled croak. "Sebastian." His voice, when it came, was heavy, weary, and stripped of all the laughter I loved. "Aurelia," he said, and the sound of my own name on his lips broke the dam of my composure. The tears I hadn't known I was holding back began to fall, hot and silent. "I'm so sorry. I can't do this." "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my hand tightening on the phone. "Sebastian, they're gone. They left." "I know," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his sigh. "They called me from the airport. They made some things very clear, Aurelia. About my future. About our future. They'll never stop. I can't build a life, a career, with that hanging over my head. I can't live in their world." He paused, and I could picture him running a hand through his hair, his face etched with defeat. "I love you, but I can't fight them. I'm not strong enough. I'm not sure anyone is." "We could leave," I pleaded, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "We could go somewhere new, somewhere they could never find us." "And do what?" he asked, his voice flat. "It's not just about them, Aurelia. It's about me. I can't be the man who stands up to them. I can't be the man you need me to be." The line went dead. He was gone. I slid from the vanity bench onto the plush carpet, the phone slipping from my hand. I pulled the burnt dress from its box, holding the ruined lace to my chest. And I began to sob. Not the quiet, dignified tears my mother had taught me were acceptable, but a raw, ragged, soul-emptying grief. I wept for the love I thought was real, for the family that had disowned me with such spectacular cruelty, and for the girl who had tried so hard to be good, only to find that it was never, ever enough. The sound echoed in the empty, silent house, a hollow testament to a future that had just gone up in smoke. That night, long after my bridesmaids had departed in a flurry of confused whispers and pitying glances, I sat alone in the darkness of my childhood room. The house was no longer a home, it was a museum of a life that was no longer mine. The scent of magnolias and scorched fabric hung in the air, a perfume of heartbreak. In my mind's eye, I saw my parents in Florence, raising glasses of Prosecco in a sun-dappled piazza, toasting to a battle won. And I saw Sebastian, retreating back into the safety of a life without me, without them. I was the wreckage they had all left behind. But as I sat there, surrounded by the debris of my former life, a tiny, defiant ember began to glow in the cold emptiness of my chest. This was not the end of my story. It couldn't be. This was an ending, a brutal and devastating one, but an ending is also, always, a beginning. Wiping the tears from my face with the back of my hand, I stood up. I would not let them have the last word. This would not be my last chapter. This was page 1. When I walked out of that house on Trad Street for the last time, I took almost nothing with me. My wallet held $117. My phone was my only link to a world that no longer felt like mine. And in a crumpled department store bag, I carried the burnt wedding dress. It felt important, somehow, to take the evidence of the crime with me. I moved through the familiar, cobblestone streets of Charleston like a phantom, the city's picturesque charm now feeling like a mockery. The cheerful pastels of Rainbow Row, the stately elegance of the historic homes, the warm, salty breeze from the harbor, it was all a beautiful lie. Beneath the polished surface was a network of secrets and cruelties I was only just beginning to understand. I couldn't stay. To remain would be to suffocate. At the bus station, I bought a one-way ticket to the farthest place I could afford, Chicago. The name itself sounded sturdy, solid, a city of broad shoulders built to withstand the wind. It seemed as good a place as any to disappear. The long ride north was a purgatory of rumbling engines and flickering fluorescent lights. I sat with my forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the lush, humid landscape of the South give way to the flat, open plains of the Midwest. With each mile, I felt a piece of the old Aurelia fall away. My mind was a relentless carousel, replaying the scenes of my undoing. My mother's cold eyes. My father's empty words. The charred lace of the dress. Sebastian's voice, hollow with resignation. All my life, I had performed a delicate balancing act, trying to be the dutiful daughter, the perfect fiancée, the poised young woman everyone expected me to be. In a single morning, the tightrope had been severed, and I had plunged into an abyss. When the bus finally pulled into the sprawling, chaotic station in Chicago, the sheer scale of the city was a shock to my system. I stepped out into a gust of wind that whipped off Lake Michigan, a raw, biting cold that felt worlds away from the gentle Carolina air. The noise was a physical force, the roar of the L train overhead, the symphony of sirens and horns, the murmur of 1,000 conversations in 100 different languages. I felt small, anonymous, and utterly adrift. I walked for hours with no destination, my thin coat useless against the relentless wind. I clutched the bag with my ruined dress like a talisman, the only tangible piece of the life I had left behind. The city's architecture soared above me, towers of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the gray, indifferent sky. People surged past me on the sidewalks, their faces set with purpose, their lives moving forward while mine had ground to a halt. Eventually, my aimless wandering led me to Millennium Park. I found a cool, metal bench facing Cloudgate, the iconic sculpture everyone called the Bean. I sat and stared at my own distorted reflection in its seamless, mirrored surface. A warped, funhouse version of a woman with hollow eyes and tear-streaked cheeks, clutching a plastic bag as if it contained all the jewels in the world. Maybe I looked unhinged. Or maybe I just looked like what I was, broken. At that moment, I didn't care. The carefully constructed dam of my composure finally broke for good. I buried my face in my hands and let myself weep, the kind of deep, gut-wrenching sobs that come from a place beyond sadness, a place of pure, undiluted loss. I cried for my stolen future, for my lost love, for the parents who had authored my pain, and for the profound, terrifying loneliness that had become my only companion. The world hurried on around me, a blur of motion and sound, but on that bench, I was an island of grief. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in that fog of sorrow. Time had ceased to have meaning. It was the screech of tires that finally pierced my awareness. A sleek, dark sedan, the kind that whispers of quiet money and importance, had pulled over to the curb just a few feet away. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and moved with an easy, unhurried grace. He wore a beautifully tailored charcoal gray coat over a simple black sweater. His hair was the color of dark coffee, with a few distinguished threads of silver at the temples, and his face was kind, etched with the faint lines of someone who smiled easily, but also thought deeply. He approached me slowly, cautiously, as one might approach a frightened animal. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and gentle, with a trace of an accent I couldn't quite place, a soft, melodic cadence that was vaguely European. "Are you all right?" I lifted my head, trying to scrub the tears from my face with the back of my hand. The question was so simple, so absurd. "Do I look all right?" The words came out sharper, more brittle than I intended. The retort was a reflex, the last defensive shield of a person with nothing left to lose. To my surprise, he didn't recoil. A small, sympathetic smile touched the corners of his mouth. "A fair point," he conceded. "Forgive me. It's a foolish question." He paused, his gaze thoughtful, not intrusive. "It's quite cold out. Would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee? Or perhaps something to eat? No agenda, I promise. Just a warm place to sit for a while." His sincerity was disarming. Every instinct I had been raised with screamed at me to refuse, to run from the kindness of a stranger in a strange city. But I was so tired. Tired of being strong, tired of being alone. I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for any sign of menace or deceit. All I saw in his dark, compassionate eyes was a genuine, uncomplicated concern. Against all my better judgment, I gave a small, hesitant nod. He introduced himself as Alistair Finch. The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it, quietly, without fanfare, suggested he was accustomed to it meaning something to others. He led me to the car, and his driver, a stout man with a kind face, held the door for me. Inside, the car was warm and silent, a cocoon of soft leather and quiet luxury that felt like another planet. We drove a few blocks to a hotel that looked more like a historic private club than a public space. Inside, he bypassed the grand lobby and led me to a small, secluded library bar with dark wood paneling, low lighting, and the hushed, comforting smell of old books and leather. He ordered a pot of tea for me and an espresso for himself. For the first few minutes, I said nothing. I simply held the warm porcelain cup in my trembling hands, letting the heat seep into my frozen fingers. I was afraid that if I started to talk, the whole ugly story would come pouring out in an incoherent, hysterical flood. But Alistair didn't press. He just sat in the armchair across from me, sipping his espresso, creating a space of quiet, patient expectation. It was his silence, more than any question, that finally gave me permission to speak. And so, the story came out. Not in a flood, but in a slow, halting trickle. My parents. The pressure. Sebastian. The meticulous wedding plans. The abandoned house. The burned dress. The final, cruel note. The phone call. I told him everything, my voice sometimes shaking with anger, sometimes breaking with a fresh wave of grief. Alistair listened. He didn't interrupt, he didn't offer facile reassurances or empty platitudes. He simply listened, his dark eyes fixed on mine, nodding occasionally, his entire being radiating a profound, empathetic attention. When a waiter brought a small plate of pastries, he pushed it gently toward me. I hadn't realized how ravenously hungry I was until the first bite of a flaky croissant melted in my mouth. As I ate, he began to talk, filling the silence with stories of his own. He spoke of his work in international heritage preservation, of buying and restoring old buildings, libraries, manor houses, small forgotten museums. He traveled constantly, living between Chicago, London, and a home he kept in Wisconsin. He spoke of his younger sister, Clara, with a deep, abiding affection. He talked about books and art and the quiet satisfaction of bringing something beautiful back from the brink of ruin. He never once asked what I was going to do next or where I was going to go. He just talked to me as if I were a person, not a problem to be solved. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt seen. Not as Marcus and Isabella Beaumont's daughter, not as Sebastian's broken-hearted ex-fiancée, but simply as Aurelia. A woman sitting in a quiet library, sharing a moment of unexpected grace with a kind stranger. As the afternoon light began to fade outside, a sense of calm I hadn't thought possible settled over me. I was still lost, still wounded, but the sharpest edges of my pain had been softened by his quiet compassion. I knew I should thank him and disappear back into the anonymity of the city, but I felt a strange reluctance to leave the safety of this small, warm room. It was then that Alistair leaned forward slightly, his expression turning serious. "Aurelia," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "What your parents did to you is unforgivable. And what your fiancé did was an act of profound cowardice." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I know this will sound impulsive, perhaps even insane. But I have a proposition for you. It is not charity, and it is not pity." I stared at him, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. "I have a home on Lake Geneva in Wisconsin," he continued. "A large, old house with a library that is in a state of complete chaos. It's filled with my late grandfather's collection of books, maps, and papers. I've been meaning to hire an archivist for years to sort through it all, to create a proper catalog. You told me you studied literature. You have a love for stories. The job is yours if you want it." A place to live, a purpose. A quiet space to heal. No strings attached. Just a chance to breathe. The offer hung in the air between us, shimmering with possibility. It was audacious, unconventional, and utterly unexpected. It was a lifeline. A chance not to escape my past, but to build a bridge away from it. To be a person who restores things, starting with myself. I looked at him, at this stranger who had shown me more kindness in a few hours than my own family had in a lifetime. In his eyes, I didn't see a rescuer. I saw a partner in the quiet work of preservation. For a moment, the world stood still. There, in the hushed, book-lined room, with the scent of tea and old paper in the air, my broken heart dared to hope again. And for the first time since my world had shattered, I saw not an ending, but a doorway. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was going to walk through it. Looking back, the days that followed feel like a dream, a sequence of events so cinematic and swift that I sometimes question the reality of it. One moment, I was a refugee on a park bench in Chicago, my entire life contained in a crumpled shopping bag. The next, I was driving north, away from the city's harsh grid and into the rolling, gentle landscape of Wisconsin, seated beside a man who felt less like a stranger and more like an answer to a question I hadn't even known how to ask. The journey to Lake Geneva was quiet. Alistair seemed to understand my need for silence, for time to process the seismic shift that was occurring in my life. He put on some soft, instrumental music, and I watched the scenery change through the window. The stark urban landscape gave way to sleepy towns, sprawling farms, and dense woodlands just beginning to hint at the coming autumn. The world was opening up, becoming softer, and with it, the tight knot of fear in my chest began to ever so slightly loosen. We arrived at his home as the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The house was not the ostentatious mansion I might have expected. It was a grand old place, yes, but it had the warm, settled look of a home that had been loved for generations. Built of dark, weathered stone and rich mahogany, with sweeping gables and wide porches, it sat nestled in a grove of ancient oak and maple trees on a gentle slope overlooking the vast, shimmering expanse of the lake. It didn't feel like a billionaire's showpiece, it felt like a sanctuary. "Welcome to Blackwood," Alistair said softly as he turned off the engine. "It's a bit rambling and eccentric, but it's home." He led me inside, and I was immediately enveloped by a sense of peace. The interior was a labyrinth of cozy, book-lined rooms, with worn oriental rugs, comfortable, slightly overstuffed furniture, and fireplaces in nearly every room. The air smelled of wood smoke, beeswax, and old paper. It was the smell of history, of stories. My stories. The next morning, Alistair's younger sister, Clara, arrived from Chicago. She blew in like a gust of warm, happy wind, her arms laden with shopping bags filled with things she insisted I would need: soft sweaters, comfortable boots, thick socks, and a collection of novels she adored. She was bright and bubbly, with the same kind eyes as her brother, but a restless, infectious energy. She enveloped me in a hug that was so genuine and fierce it almost brought me to tears. "Welcome, welcome," she chirped, her smile lighting up her entire face. "Alistair has told me everything, and I just want to say, your parents are monsters and your ex is a wet noodle. You are officially one of us now. We're a bit quirky, the Finches, but we are fiercely loyal." Her blunt, cheerful assessment of my situation was so startlingly refreshing that I couldn't help but laugh. It was the first real, unforced laugh that had escaped my lips in what felt like an eternity. In that moment, I felt a flicker of kinship, a sense of belonging that I hadn't realized I was so starved for. Alistair showed me to the library. It was magnificent. A two-story room with a soaring ceiling, a spiral staircase leading to a galleried upper level, and a huge bay window that looked out over the lake. And it was, as he'd promised, in a state of beautiful, glorious chaos. Books were stacked on every available surface, spilling from shelves, piled on tables, and peeking out of wooden crates. There were rolled-up maps, leather-bound journals, and boxes of letters tied with faded ribbon. My grandfather was a collector of stories, Alistair explained, gesturing to the room. He believed that every object had a history worth saving. Your job, should you choose to accept it, is to be the keeper of his stories. No deadline, no pressure. Just find their order. And so, my life began to find its new rhythm. My days were spent in the quiet, dusty sanctuary of the library. I would lose myself for hours, my hands covered in the fine dust of history. I unrolled brittle, hand-drawn maps of places that no longer existed. I read through letters written in elegant, sloping script, detailing love affairs and business dealings from a century past. I held first editions of books whose pages hadn't been turned in decades. With each object I catalogued, with each story I uncovered, I felt a piece of my own fractured self begin to knit back together. My work gave me purpose. It gave me a sense of competence and value that had nothing to do with whom I was born to or whom I was supposed to marry. My evenings were spent with Alistair and, on weekends, with Clara. We would cook simple meals together in the large, warm kitchen, our conversation easy and rambling. We'd take long walks along the shore of the lake as the seasons turned, the vibrant greens of summer slowly giving way to the fiery reds and golds of autumn. The water was a constant, calming presence, its surface changing with the light, one day a placid, silver mirror, the next a choppy, dark slate under a brooding sky. Alistair and I talked for hours. He never pushed me to speak of my past, but when I was ready, he listened without judgment. I told him about the crushing weight of my parents' expectations, the feeling of being a beautiful object in a display case. He, in turn, told me about the loneliness of his own childhood after his parents died, the immense pressure of taking over the family business at a young age, and his search for a life of quiet meaning beyond the accumulation of wealth. We discovered a shared language in our separate solitudes. With him, I felt a sense of safety I had never known. It wasn't just physical safety, it was an emotional safety. I could be quiet, I could be sad, I could be angry, and his regard for me never wavered. His affection wasn't a reward for good behavior, it was a steady, unconditional presence. The attraction between us grew slowly, organically, like a deep-rooted tree. It was in the way he'd bring me a cup of tea in the library without my having to ask, the way his hand would brush mine as we reached for the same book, the way he would look at me across the dinner table, a quiet smile playing on his lips. One crisp October evening, about 3 months after my arrival, we were sitting on the porch, wrapped in thick blankets, watching the moon rise over the lake. The silence between us was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. "Aurelia," he said, his voice a low murmur in the twilight. "I know my initial proposition was one of employment, a safe harbor. But it has become something more for me. This house, it was just a house before you came. Now it's a home. You've made it a home." He turned to look at me, his gaze direct and full of a profound warmth that made my heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar emotion. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply, as if stating a fact of nature like the turning of the earth. "I know your heart is still healing. I would never rush you. But I want you to know that my feelings for you are real and they are patient." Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time in my life, they were not tears of pain or loss. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. "I think I'm falling in love with you, too," I whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and exhilarating. Our wedding took place a month later, on a brisk November afternoon. It was nothing like the grand spectacle I had planned in Charleston. There was no guest list, no string quartet, no mountain of flowers. It was just the four of us, Alistair, Clara, me, and a kind, elderly judge from the local town, gathered on the shore of the lake. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches stark against the pale blue sky. Clara had found a simple, cream-colored wool dress for me. I wore no veil, no jewels, just a small, wild bouquet of late autumn asters she had picked from the garden. As I stood before Alistair, the cold wind whipping stray strands of hair across my face, I felt a sense of rightness, of pure, unadorned truth. He took my hands in his grip warm and steady. "Aurelia," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he recited the vows we had written together. "I promise to be your sanctuary. I promise to honor your past, to celebrate your present, and to build a future with you that is founded on respect, kindness, and a love that is a quiet, steady flame. You're the keeper of stories, and our story is the one I will treasure most. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife, Alistair didn't kiss me with a performative passion. He simply leaned in and gently rested his forehead against mine, a gesture of such intimate tenderness that it sealed every broken piece of me whole. In that moment, I wasn't the daughter of Marcus and Isabella Beaumont. I was not Sebastian's abandoned fiancée. I was Aurelia Finch, a woman who had walked through fire and found a home on the other side. A woman who was finally, beautifully free. 3 days after our quiet wedding on the lake, the world felt reborn. The peace that had settled over me was no longer a fragile, tentative thing, but a deep, resonant hum in my soul. Life at Blackwood had taken on a new dimension. Alistair and I were partners, our lives now formally, beautifully intertwined. We built our days around simple rituals: early morning coffee, watching the sunrise over the water, long hours working in our respective quiet spaces, me in the library, him in his study, and evenings spent together, reading by the fire. That weekend, Clara came up from Chicago, ostensibly to help me organize a particularly chaotic corner of the library, but really to celebrate our new reality. The house was filled with her infectious laughter and the smell of the apple pie she insisted on baking. The three of us felt like a complete unit, a small, tightly knit tribe. On Sunday afternoon, the autumn light was particularly beautiful, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. "We need a picture," Clara declared. "A proper family portrait to mark the occasion." She herded us outside, positioning Alistair and me under the sprawling branches of a massive copper beech tree near the water's edge. She fussed with my hair, straightened Alistair's color, and then set the camera on a timer, dashing to squeeze in between us. We stood huddled together against the crisp air, our arms linked. Alistair's arm was warm and solid around my waist. Clara leaned her head on my shoulder, grinning broadly. As the camera clicked, I found myself smiling, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached my eyes. In the photo, we were a portrait of quiet, unconventional happiness. Later that evening, curled up on the sofa with a blanket and a cup of tea, I looked at the picture on Clara's camera. For so long, the idea of family had been a source of pain, a word associated with duty and disappointment. Seeing the three of us so clearly bound by affection and choice felt like a redefinition. On impulse, I posted the photo to my long-dormant social media account. I wrote a simple caption: "Autumn in Wisconsin." Incredibly grateful for this new chapter. It was a small act, a quiet declaration of my new life. Perhaps a part of me, a naive and still hopeful part, thought my parents might see it and feel a pang of remorse. Maybe they would see my happiness and understand, finally, what they had thrown away. I should have known better. The first call came less than an hour later. It was my mother. I stared at her name on the screen, my blood turning to ice. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, a text appeared. "Who are these people, Aurelia?" Then my father's number flashed. Then a number I didn't recognize, which left a voicemail in my mother's clipped, furious tone. The notifications began to cascade, a digital avalanche of anger and recrimination. "After everything we've done for you, you run off and marry some stranger without a word to us? This is a betrayal of your family. You are a Beaumont. Have you forgotten what that means? Come home at once. This ridiculous fantasy is over. What have you told these people about us? You ungrateful child. We gave you everything." The messages were a volley of guilt, manipulation, and wounded pride. Each word was a carefully sharpened dart aimed at the most vulnerable parts of me. The old panic began to rise, the familiar, conditioned response to their disapproval. My hand trembled as I read the words, their fury reaching across 1,000 miles to poison my sanctuary. Alistair, seeing the color drain from my face, came and sat beside me on the sofa. He didn't ask what was wrong, he knew. He gently took the phone from my hand, read a few of the messages, and his expression hardened. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't offer advice. He simply took my hand in both of his grip firm and grounding. "You don't have to answer them, Aurelia," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in my storm. "You don't owe them an explanation. You don't owe them anything. Their power over you ends the moment you decide it does." Clara, who had been in the kitchen, came in and saw the scene. She sat on my other side, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "He's right," she said softly. "This is your family now. Right here. Let them yell into the void." I looked from Alistair's steady gaze to Clara's fierce, protective one. I thought about the life I had been building here, day by quiet day. The work in the library, the walks by the lake, the easy laughter, the unconditional love. And I thought about the life they wanted for me, a life where their approval was the currency I had to endlessly earn. With a deep, shuddering breath, I took my phone back from Alistair. My fingers were surprisingly steady as I navigated to my mother's contact information and pressed block. I did the same for my father. I blocked every unknown number that had messaged me. With each tap of the screen, I felt a weight lift. It wasn't an act of anger or revenge. It was an act of preservation. I was choosing my peace. I was choosing myself. I was choosing my future over my history. The calls and messages stopped. The silence that followed was not the hollow, empty silence of my parents' house in Charleston. It was a clean, peaceful silence, the sound of a boundary being drawn, the sound of freedom. In the months and years that followed, my life with Alistair blossomed. We traveled the world for his work, and I saw wonders I had only read about in books. We wandered the ancient streets of Rome, explored misty castles in the Scottish Highlands, and got lost in the labyrinthine markets of Marrakesh. But the best part of every journey was always coming home to Blackwood, to the quiet rhythm of our life by the lake. My work in the library became a true passion. I began writing articles for historical journals and even started work on a book about the forgotten female letter writers I had discovered in the archives. I was no longer just the keeper of someone else's stories. I was creating my own. My parents never tried to contact me again. The door I had closed remained shut. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, a shadow of sadness would pass over me, a grief for the family I should have had, for the mother-daughter relationship I had always craved. But the sadness no longer consumed me. It was a faint, silvery scar, a reminder of a wound that had healed. I still have the burned wedding dress. It's packed away in a cedar chest in the attic. I don't keep it as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to transformation. It's a symbol of the fire that I had to walk through to find my way here. It's the scorched earth from which a new, stronger life was able to grow. My story didn't go the way I planned. It went the way I needed it to. It led me away from a life of gilded obligation and toward a life of authentic love and self-respect. It taught me that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build. It's the people who see you, who champion you, and who offer you a safe harbor in the storm. And as I stand on the porch of our home, Alistair's hand in mine, watching the sun set over the calm, endless water, I am filled with a profound and quiet gratitude. My name is Aurelia Finch, and this is the story I was always meant to live.